So we have the current framework there on the left with the 12 professional practices. And on the right, we have a very crude, I must admit, this is quite a crude visual of the framework that we came up with. And if you count those practices, you'll see that there's 11 practices there rather than the 12 in the original. So we lost managing resources from the original framework and integrated that into planning lessons and courses. And we also lost understanding educational policies and practices from the original framework, and those were incorporated into understanding my context. So if we just look at that revised framework, this a very initial draft framework that we came up with, and how we organised it and why we organised it in the way we do. So at the centre there, we've got knowing the subject, which was part of the original framework. Knowing the subject includes knowing the language, knowing the English language, but it also includes pedagogy, understanding of pedagogy. And we also recognise that each of these other professional practices has its own subject knowledge base that is worth exploring. So it's not that that is more important than any of the other practices. There's no hierarchy here. It's just that we put that in the middle because it feeds into everything else. And then the green circle around the outside. This, as I said, we wanted to foreground the idea of context. So understanding my context became part of that outer circle, but also understanding and developing my learners with a focus on them, on how to increase their well-being, how to help them to develop as lifelong learners, understanding their needs in the classroom and how we can adapt our teaching and learning to help them really develop and increase their proficiency in the language. And then also understanding and developing my own professional identity, which, as I've said, was a big part of the literature, big finding from this review. And those three different practices form that outside circle. And then the blue ones are really the sort of more core practices, if you like, the nitty-gritty of daily teaching and learning. So planning lessons and courses, managing the lesson and assessing learning. All three of those were in the original framework, but we sort of grouped them together using this blue colour. And then the red or orange ones, whichever colour that is, those sort of extend those core practices, those feed into those core practices. And again, none of these are new, they were all in the original framework. So using transferable skills is the same as promoting 21st century skills. Digital technologies is ICTs, integrating ICT. Multilingual approaches, that was in the original framework. So that's how we organised it and why we organised it the way that we did. We also kept the 4 levels of development. So this was quite important. We didn't want to go start talking about sort of experts and novices in terms of levels. We liked these and thought they were still very relevant in terms of what we'd found throughout this review. And I think we also know from our example or from our experience of the pandemic that even people who've been teaching for a long time, when the context suddenly changes, they need to sort of begin to reassess their skills in that new context. So the pandemic made all of us, I think, begin to reassess how do we do teaching and learning in this new context, this new online context in which we find ourselves. And so we need to come back to some of these professional practices and think about them again. Okay, so I want to just look at how we might use this revised framework. So you can come to this framework at any point in your career, and you can come into any of these professional practices. You can start with any one. You don't need to start at a particular professional practice. So let's just think of an example. So imagine I have a dyslexic child in my class, and I've never had a dyslexic child in my class before. So I'm thinking about how can I really include that child, and how can I make learning and teaching relevant for them. So I might want to start, for example, with the professional practice of using inclusive practices, and really look into that and try and understand what it means to be inclusive in terms of this dyslexic child. I might want to explore the knowledge base, that knowing the subject of dyslexia, really understand more about that and how that impacts on teaching and learning. Then I might want to look at how I can incorporate everything I've learned into the way I plan my lessons, how to make them more inclusive. What sort of activities do I need to maybe integrate for this particular learner? But also looking at of the broader context, how does this fit with all of my learners who I have in this class? So how can I make this inclusive for everybody, not just the dyslexic child, but for everyone in this context? And also I might want to look at my own beliefs, my own understanding of inclusivity, and how that impacts on what I'm trying to do in the classroom with this particular child in my context. So that's one example of how we might use the revised framework. This is a second example. So we've said that artificial intelligence is really growing, and we know that our learners are using it, and we know that they're using it to help them do their work. They're using it particularly maybe to help them do their writing. So if we're assessing writing and we know that our learners are using artificial intelligence, then we might want to think about how we actually assess writing that has been assisted by artificial intelligence. So again, we might start with this professional practice of assessing learning, and look again at our understanding of assessment, different types of assessment, how they might work. We might want to look at digital technologies again. What is AI? How does it help? What sort of text does it generate? And deepen our understanding of AI. We might want to look at our learners. How are they using AI? What's their understanding of AI? Because often our learners are ahead of us in the game in this type of thing. And understand really what skills they might need to develop to enable them to incorporate IA in a critical and a useful way. Again, look at our own beliefs and understandings on our own assumptions about things like AI and what we think about, and if we want to just reject it and say we shouldn't be using these sorts of things and our learners shouldn't be using things, or whether actually we need to perhaps look at a bit more at those beliefs and those attitudes and try and understand a little bit more about this. Of course, all this is going to impact then on how we might plan our lessons, to incorporate maybe some of these skills that we think learners might be able to develop, critical practices, particularly looking at texts that have been developed by generated by AI, and how we might help our learners to understand those and to use those and to develop those. We might want to think about how to be inclusive about who might be left behind by things like AI in our assessments, and how we can really include everyone in this. And then, of course, we might want to look, as I've said, at the transferable skills that will be useful for our learners. So that's a second example, I think, of how we might use the framework. And then the final example here, and I think this applies perhaps more to a group of learners, a group of teachers, how they might come together maybe to use the framework to explore something. And this is In the case of perhaps a new educational policy, something maybe that the government or the education ministry has asked us to incorporate, it might come at school level, something that we are being asked to do. And we know from the research that often teachers don't really feel much ownership of these new policies and changes, and maybe they're really not sure how to incorporate them. Often they haven't had a lot of training, and so they're not really sure, they're not very confident about using them in their classes. So perhaps a group of teachers might want to come together and use the framework to explore a bit more, starting with their context and maybe why this is being asked of us, how it relates to our context. Because context, we're not just talking about our own classroom, that micro context, but the sort of broader context as well, the school context, the regional context, maybe the national context, even the global context. We might want to look at the knowledge base for that new educational policy and explore, maybe work out where perhaps we have gaps in our knowledge and what sort of things that we need to explore and develop. Again, how does all that then, once we've understood more about this new policy, this new practice, how do we incorporate that into planning lessons and courses so we can go to that professional practice, look at the different criteria there. And finally, perhaps how we might use digital technologies or all of these practices in that red triangle there and how they might be impacted and might impact on that new policy. I think then that I've said what I want to say now. I think I can safely say that the finalised framework, and it looks very different as far as I understand from that draft framework that I've shown you, I think it is on its way. I think the report is also on its way, so you'll be able to find out a lot more detail, everything that I've talked about today in that final report. We hope that you find it useful and that you can really use this over however many years to come to be able to help you develop in your own personal development, but also as communities as well. And so thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.